Our next speaker is, I'm really feeling greatly honored to introduce our next speaker, Dr. B. Madhava Puri. He's received his PhD in theoretical chemistry from Georgetown University, and he did postdoc at the National Bureau of Standards in Washington, D.C. He published technical papers in the Journal of Chemical Physics, and then Dr. Puri turned to Indian School of Yoga to learn about consciousness and started Hegel.org website. And currently he's a serving director of Princeton Bhakti Vedanta Institute. And Dr. Puri is also a visionary behind this Science and Scientists annual conference series since 2013. And we are fortunate to hear from Dr. Puri and about his talk. His topic of the talk is Death and Desire, Negativity at the Foundation of Life. Please, Dr. Madhava Puri, you can proceed. Start your talk.
So we've been hearing about the need, you can say, of finding a way of understanding life beyond a mere mechanical, molecular ideology, I would call it, that we are applying to the evidence that we find in nature, that there is seems to be something much more sophisticated involved, and trying to understand what the activity of an organism is due to. If it's simply mechanical processes of physics and chemistry, then it doesn't seem to provide us with sufficient evidence or sufficient explanation of what's going on. So in this talk, I'm not going to claim to be giving any scientific explanation of those things, but just trying to present a framework, a different framework or a philosophical framework by which we can try to relate our rational ideas of life, our rational conceptions of life with what is going on at the cellular level, and organismic level. Might be a little difficult. I feel a lot of difficulty actually in presenting this because it's a very different idea than what we normally think of when we talk about biological life. Make it smaller. Make it smaller. We can see the panel. So I thought the first thing we have to do is try to make clear what we mean by the negativity, concept of negativity. Generally, science, empirical science, is considered positivistic. Positivistic means we rely on the evidence of our senses, empiricism. And of course, the empirical evidence must be organized by a rational, systematic thinking at the subjective level. Generally, physics or modern science in general doesn't consider the activity of the rational systematization that's at the background of science. And that's a very important part, actually, of science. That's why we have started this conference series called science and scientist. Science is generally left out, the activity, rational activity of the scientist, which is an essential part of science. And yet it is not, let's say, explicitly spoken about. It is not explicitly included in our explanations of science. So we want to examine that idea and see what is there a possible way of correcting that. And I found that by reading Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel, the philosopher, German philosopher, that there is a very interesting way of connecting the rational activity with the material phenomena of life, of nature, rather. Okay. So although this is going to sound somewhat difficult to understand, because we're going to try to combine positive and negative arguments, the positivism of science and with the negativity of philosophical dialectics, it may be somewhat confusing because we're not used to thinking in this way. And it's going to be a very new idea, I think, except for those who have studied Hegel in the past. They may know something about these problems and what all this is about. So could you make this slide a little shorter so that we can see it? Slimmer.
It has to be full screen. It has to be full screen.
Huh?
It has to be full screen. Otherwise, you can't see it.
So we start out with this first perplexing idea that life is an existing contradiction. We are generally taught that if something is a contradiction, then it does not exist. This was Zeno's types of arguments that he would present. Movement can be thought of as a contradiction. It requires that something like a moving arrow must be and not be at the same point at the same time. Of course, everyone accepts that there is movement in the world. So that, but when we think about it carefully, this contradiction lies there at the center of movement. An arrow is going to be, if it's moving, according to the idea of movement, must be and not be at a particular point at the same time. It's passing through that point. And that passing through is an instantaneous passing through. So what it says actually, in fact, is that there is a contradiction there at the point of through which is passing. So life is also a contradiction in that sense, that an existing contradiction in that sense, that movement exists and it's a contradiction. So life could be a contradiction and still exist. It's not that because it's a contradiction, it doesn't exist. So that now, what do we mean by contradiction here? And here we're explaining that life is what it is not. Life is what it is not. So how can something be what it is not? This can mean that the essence of life lies in what it lacks. So we can also say life is a process. This is similar to the existing contradiction we found in movement. But life is not just matter and motion. A jar of chemicals on a speeding train does not suddenly come to life. The process is more like a drive or need, a necessity for the potentiality to actualize itself. Yeah. There's something covering this side.
I know. Can't do anything about it.
I can read it.
Is there another way to say that life is what it is not?
Make it larger. How can you read that? Give me that now. Trying to figure out here how to get this to show properly. All right, so anyhow, I don't know how to do this, and the Krishna here doesn't know how to do it, so we have to deal with this. The idea here is that life transcends its finite reified status. This is what we mean by what life is what it is not. Its given status, its being, you can say, is transcended because the organism is a moving, a living thing. It is not merely a stratified or rigid structure, right? It's a living organism. This means it's constantly changing under the influence of change, a movement. So that life is more than just the static reified structure that we can see under a microscope or picture within our mind. So is there another way of saying that life is what it is not? So life is a negation of itself. Not means negation. So by saying that life is a negation of itself, we seem to be dividing life into two parts. The part that is life and the part that is not, or the negated part. If we call the part that is life self, and the part that is not life the other, or we may also call the object or body, then life is a self that is negation of its other, that is not self. I hope that's clear. Yet, life is the identity of self and body. Yet, as life, yet as life, the self identifies itself with its other, or as an identity of itself and its other. A unity of self and body is an existing contradiction. I hope this is coming across. What we're saying here is that the self identifies itself with the body. When we say I, for instance, that self, that is the I, we identify directly with the body. We say I am an American or a male or a female or whatever the identity is, it is connected with the body, although it's the self that is making that connection. So that was what we call identity of itself and its body, or what is generally the idea of life. Another way to say this is the simultaneous identity and difference of itself with its other. But this other is not just any other, it is specific or determinate other or negation of the self. In other words, the other or object is a totality of determinations of the self called its body. Now, we must not misunderstand negation as annihilation. And dialectical negation is not negation. When we say the self is not the body, we don't mean that there's no body, that the body somehow disappears. It is negation of the body. Therefore, the body is there, but in a negated form. So mathematics has been useful to science because it introduces many ideas the positivist science of empirical observation does not notice or account for. For example, antimatter. The existence of antimatter was discovered from the solutions of the quadratic equations of physics. Actually, it was Paul Dirac in the around 1930 who was the first to come up with the idea of antimatter by trying to solve the problems of the equation, rather, of quantum mechanics and relativity. He was a great mathematician to be able to combine those two fields. And he came up with a solution to the problem, which involves the square root of a number. And the square root of a number we all know has a positive and negative solution, equally valid. So there was this negative value that had to be accounted for. And Dirac said this was to be called antimatter, and he gave the properties of that antimatter as having the negative value, just like an electron. Everything will be the same except it'll have a positive charge. As the antimatter of an electron will have a positive charge, but otherwise the same mass and basically the same qualities. All right, next. When matter and antimatter come into contact, however, they annihilate each other. We could call antimatter the negation of matter, but this is mathematical negation. The negation of 1, for instance, is -1. It's not 0. -1 is less than 0 or less than nothing, but it has a value, an absolute value the same as 1. Just like in mathematics, rational logic or dialectics also offers additional insights beyond the positivistic empiricism that science generally employs. Dialectical negation of the physical is not nothing. It is simply not physical or not material. If the physical exists, then so does the negative. Negation does not imply non-existence, just that I don't know what it says there.
Not non-existence, but non-physical.
Huh?
Not non-existence, but non-physical.
Okay. So negation implies not non-existence, but the negation of the physical. Huh? That was the point. Now, well, let's go up. Okay. So then how does the non-physical or non-material interact with the material? So there are relations, as already established, as we have said, it is the negation. The negation of the material is a non-material. So according to dialectical reasoning, the non-material and material coexist. There is no problem of their coexistence and no problem of their interaction through negativity or through negation. So, for example, thought and being. The chair in my room and the thought or concept of a chair exist together as a unity, although each is a dialectical negation of the other. One is material, the other is non-material. But can anyone say that a chair and its concept are not related? The concept and its actualization, then generally we say that a concept comes before the construction of an artifact. Thus, the concept of a chair precedes the actual thing a carpenter constructs. A blueprint is made before the actual construction of a building takes place. Aristotle considered the concept to be part of the explanation of cause. He called it formal cause. The carpenter is the efficient cause, and the building materials are the material cause. The purpose is the final cause. So these four aspects of cause, we call them, they're not exactly different causes. They're all aspects of one process called cause, if we want to call it like that. These four aspects of cause are distinctive from one another, but not separable. The fathers of modern science simply excised the formal and final aspects of cause from Aristotle's complete formulation. The result is that modern science is short or vague on explanations of origins or purposes. We all know this, that when we try to understand the origin of life or the universe or whatever, we always come back to the Big Bang or some type of transformation of things. But that's not an explanation, actually. So life is the identity of concept and its objectivity. Kant recognized that purpose is the object of a concept. This concept-object relation was more of an unexplained or unmediated one for Kant. Hegel recognized the concept-object relation in terms of self-negation or self-determination. The concept and object are intimately united as an identity-indifference. So concept and object are related again, not by negation, but rather self-negation. Self-negation means that the concept is self-determining its own object. The concept is a rational entity that can determine its own objectivity, determine its own properties, or its own characteristics, its own specifics. So we call this an identity-indifference. The concept is identical to its characteristics, yet its characteristics are different from the identity in that they're multiple, whereas the concept is a unity or a one. Now let's talk about the concept. In Hegel's Science of Logic, the concept is a highly determinate and systematic dialectical whole of unity. The concept is a self-determining or self-differentiating, referring to the objectivity, as well as self-reflective or integrating unity, which refers to the subjectivity of the relationship. That which is or exists as a negation of a particular body is called a universal. Generally, life as an individual has an objectivity outside itself, beyond its body or environment. Generally, the idea of a universal is the negation of the particular. Universal and particular differ by negation again. Now, this idea of negation, negentropy, negativity. Physical, non-living phenomena generally follow the second law of thermodynamics, which predicts a spontaneous increase in entropy. Living organisms tend to promote and maintain system unity and order, resisting the spontaneous increase of disorder or entropy found in mechanical non-living systems. Erwin Schrödinger wrote a book. We know Erwin Schrödinger from physics. He wrote a book called What is Life? And he gave as a characteristic that life involves negentropy, a negativity because it promotes its own unity and order, whereas non-living systems tend to disorder, according to the second law of thermodynamics. He also is famous for stating that life consisted of non-periodic crystals. This was before the discovery of DNA, and he predicted that life, and he said that life consisted of non-periodic crystals, whereas non-life consists of periodic crystals. Another distinction. Now, material things, including technological artifacts, have a purpose that originates externally. Cells have their purpose within themselves, which is called by Kant as nature's way. In general, an organism exhibits a unitive nature that negates the non-unitive or dispersive tendency of the inorganic or non-living world. So we distinguish cells and things. We don't call a thing a self, and then we don't call a living organism like a human being a thing. We distinguish between these. So material things including technological artifacts, have a purpose that originates externally. Technology means mechanics with externally added on purpose. Technology takes mechanical systems and adds to them a purpose. This is an external purpose because it's being added to the thing. It doesn't come from the mechanics. It's added to a mechanical process. Cells, on the other hand, have their purpose within themselves, what Immanuel Kant called nature's work. From studies of embryology, we learn that the ontogeny of an organism follows a basic developmental pattern of differentiation and specialization of an initial unity or zygote by way of division, not aggregation, revealing a continual process of negation of unity while balancing this dispersion with integral unity at the same time. This demonstration of a negative power in living organisms indicates the existence of something at work in organisms that is not explicable in terms of mere positive matter. Now, a hint to what this negativity might be was given by Hegel and is often quoted phrase of Spinoza, omnis determinatio et negatio. Every determination is a negation. This emphasizes the interconnectedness of positive and negative attributes or qualities. Determination is positive, and negation negative. In this regard, the Greek philosopher Plotinus considered that the one was the first principle of the absolute. Parmenides before him considered pure being as the absolute. This simplistic idea was challenged by many philosophers, especially Heraclitus, who taught the dynamic, ever-changing nature of reality as becoming rather than pure being or static being. If we consider the Western or Greek positive idea of the one from the eastern side of the world, or India, they define one negatively as advaita or non-dual. The simple abstract idea was also challenged by the succeeding philosophers in terms of identity and difference. Yet here we see the same concept, one, can be stated positively or negatively as not two or non-dual. This says that the determination one is at the same time and equivalently not dual. Every determination is simultaneously positive and negative, therefore. They are not separable. To pose one is to pose the other. The ancients understood that everything comes from what it is not. Thus Socrates said that the idea taller comes from shorter. The modern saint Bhaktivedanta Swami once gave the example, if everyone were blind, we could not say blind. We can only understand blind because someone can see. These words are not unrelated to each other. They're necessary for it. A determinate thought always implies its opposite or negation. Day means it is not night. Being means it is not non-being or nothing. We may state or assert the positive, but we ignore that we are also simultaneously affirming the negative, that a subject is not the object is true of the very definition of these terms. The infinite contains within itself its own negation as the not finite. Self implies it's not other, the negation of its otherness. For Hegel in the science of logic, his science of logic uses these negativities in the development of its concept of life. The objective constituent content of an organism has its corresponding negative or subjective aspect, called its concept, which determines the specific nature of the constituent content. In the living organism, then subjective and objective aspects do not externally oppose one another, but mutually interpenetrate each other as simultaneously one and different. It is this unity and difference of subject and object gives rise to primitive feelings of sensation, or the sensation of the living organism in nature. Again, the concept is a dynamic form. Therefore, when it's identified with a material body, the body itself is not sentient, but the sentient concept identifying with the body makes the body sentient. As a universal, the concept of life in all individual organisms, its genus in general, actualizes itself as a negation of all indifferent objectivity, called being in itself, transforming it into being for itself, or the concept. This is called cognition. Being in itself, this is the nature of the object itself on its own, without being influenced by an observer. When the observer knows or cognizes the object which is in itself, he negates the object in itself. He doesn't annihilate the object, but the negation of the object being in itself is made so that the object becomes for cognition, for the cognitive being. This being for itself, or for the cognitive self, is different from the being in itself. This was Kant's famous duality. He said the difference between noumena and phenomena. Noumena is what is in itself. Phenomena is what we experience of it. So this transformation occurs between being in itself to being for consciousness. This being for itself is a negation of being in itself. So the living organism is not neutral toward its active process of negating what it is, its being. It is a self-determining unity or self, since determination is negation. This idea nicely explains Maturana and Varela's conclusion that living systems are cognitive systems, and living as a process is a process of cognition. This statement is valid for all organisms, with or without a nervous system. So the basic principle of any cognitive system doesn't just perceive the being itself, but it converts it into being for itself. This is called knowing or cognition. To know means that the object itself becomes for the self. Now, these things, to understand them, in their proper way, it's difficult to just state them blatantly like that. A little study of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit will hopefully make these things much clearer, and not that I can expect to teach you what you don't know as far as Hegel's philosophy is concerned. That requires a detailed study on one's own to learn about these ideas. But I think they have a very important application in the formation of a framework for understanding life. Done yet?
10 minutes.
All right, since the fundamental concept, object, identity, and difference of the individual living organism is based on an existing concept or identity, it finds itself embedded in an environment or difference towards which the organism feels a gap or lack of unity within itself. As a concept, unity, object, identity, and difference. In other words, it's the individuality of the living organism that sets him against an environment. To be an individual means an individual in what? A milieu in which the individual exists has differentiated from the individual itself. There's a difference between the being in itself of the individual, and the being for itself rather of the individual, and the being in itself of its environment. So this lack is called desire. The being for itself, the being in itself, the concept wants to express, wants to include within itself actual being or being in itself, but it is only finds itself in a situation of being for itself. So it has to act to overcome this lack, which is negatively felt as the need and positively described as purpose. This is the basis of inner teleology of the concept acting to actualize itself. There is a similarity here between Aristotle's conception of the dynamis entelechia energia relationship and Hegel's concept activity objective content. Hegel distinguishes two levels of life here. The first as a living individual as such, and the second as a living process involving the organism's relationship to the environment, although they are both related. A third distinction comes in the organism's relation to other organisms in the reproductive act, which is called the genus process. Here, death plays the important role of demonstrating the fleeting nature of the particular or specific organism under the universal genus, which is intrinsic to and inseparable from the organism. This is because of the simultaneous universal, particular, and individual features of every concept, as in this case, genus, species, and specimen. The universal is a negation of the particular. It is simultaneously the positive identity of itself, and the universal dynamically maintains its identity while negating the particularity or specific the unity of the universal and particular is the individual, or the undividable universal particular unity. This may be difficult to conceive because of the abstract nature of the terms, so it'll be easier to think of a concrete example where the movement of thought may be more apparent. A tree standing outside your house is generically called tree, like any other similar object in the world. This is the universal tree, although this is not a botanical name. We may loosely call it the genus. But the tree is also a particular species, say oak or spruce, and a specific specimen or individual of that species that is growing in your house, near your house. The universal tree applies to every specimen of tree we experience, in which case we could say that it is and is not each individual tree, because it identifies itself with each specimen and negates it at the same time in order to preserve itself for all the other trees. The activity we call life is universal in all living organisms, but the death of a particular organism does not affect the universality that is part of all life. In this sense, the death of a particular serves to emphasize the universal aspect of the life that is always part of the particular. This death is not only the negation of the activity of an organism we call life, but also establishes the positivity of the universal aspect of life, which religion has always maintained as preserved, even in the face of death. This universal is the concept, and its negative or objective content in logic which is the externality of nature, is manifest as soul in a body. A further level beyond nature, called second nature or culture, we can determine as spiritual, where life takes on a more universal significance in which communal, social, political, social, cultural, religious, and philosophical life predominates. There is another level of negativity of death or ceasing to be that is more integral to life and its intrinsic dynamic nature. The metaphysical view of the positive conception of static, reified being understands death as non-being or nothing, a long dark night of nothingness. A dynamic metaphysical conception, like Heraclitus understands being, as a moment of the living, which is much a coming to be as a ceasing to be in the activity and actuality of becoming. The moment of coming to be is the transition of nothing to being, while the ceasing to be is the transition of being to nothing. The unity of these two moments is called becoming. In other words, being and nothing are not fixed in exclusive opposition, but connected in mutual correlation. This logical or metaphysical conception is visibly manifest in nature as growth. For example, a seed produces a stem as the seed itself ceases to be, while a leaf comes to be from the stem. The leaf then transforms into a bud, and from the disappearance of the bud, the flower is produced. Life is sometimes understood in terms of metabolism, a continuous process in which there is a building up or creation of molecular structure called anabolism, as existing structures are worn down and cease to be, or catabolism. The maturation of the human body from childhood to youth to old age follows the same pattern of creation and cessation of bodies. Change itself requires negation as part of the essential nature. In this sense, death, as much as creation, is an ever-present feature of actuality, or an actuality as an active living presence. Time as the coming to be of the future and ceasing to be of the past, as united in the ever-present existent. Is united in the ever-existent present. The work of negativity is an unendingly necessary part of positive truth, as Hegel reminds us, which otherwise becomes mere edification without the labor of the negative. It is necessary to consider the negativity or reversal of the modern scientific view of nature as a network of more or less reified substance without recognition of a more dynamic system of subject-object relational development. Mechanical principles are useful in constructing artifacts, such as buildings and machines, but when the science of mechanical and chemical relations attempts to explain wholes, such as organisms, in terms of aggregating parts, nature does not exhibit herself as constructing organisms in that way. Rather, there is a circular reciprocal relation between wholes and parts, in which the whole participates in production of its parts as much as the parts produce the whole.
So we'll just take 5 minutes out of the Q&A to finish the presentation.
Hegel explains the logical elements in the development of the idea of life in the science of logic. This also shows how life is different from the logic of mechanisms, chemism, and teleology. This means that life cannot be properly comprehended in terms of mechanical, chemical, or teleological principles because of its basic subjectivity or self-conscious nature. Kant explains in his critique of judgment that an organism is both an organized and a self-organizing being. Now, if we consider a material whole,
Quoting from Kant.
huh?
This is quoting from Kant now.
Kant. Oh, yes, this is a quote from Kant. He said, now if we consider a material whole, as far as its form is concerned, as a product of the parts and their forces and the capacity combined by themselves, including as parts other materials that they add to themselves, we represent a mechanical kind of generation. But from this, there arises no concept of a whole and an end, whose internal possibility presupposes throughout the idea of a whole on which even the constitution and mode of action of the parts depends, which is just how we must represent the organized body. The ontogeny of a living organism exhibits a reciprocal conditioning between interacting parts, creating the whole, the unity, the complete organism, while simultaneously the whole causing the parts to develop and emerge. Again, quoting from Kant, for a body, therefore, which is to be judged as a natural end in itself, and in accordance with its internal possibility, is required that the parts reciprocally produce each other as far as both their form and their combination is concerned, and thus produce a whole out of their own causality, the concept of which, conversely, is in turn the cause of it, and in accordance with the principle. Consequently, the connection of efficient causes could at the same time be judged as an effect through the final cause. This was Kant's explanation. Kant also raised the problem of the one-sidedness of our own thinking, the antinomy of the power of judgment, he called it. First maximum of the power of judgment is the thesis. All generations of material things and their forms must be judged as possible in accordance with merely mechanical laws. The second antithesis is that some products of material nature cannot be judged as possible according to purely mechanical laws. Judging them requires an entirely different law of causality, namely that of final cause. When the intrinsic subjectivity of life and the capacity for self-consciousness of the human being are properly acknowledged, then the need to go beyond teleological explanation becomes apparent. Well, how much time do we have?
Would you like to finish this last two paragraphs?
Well, I haven't been able to go through this entire lecture in the time that it was allotted to me. I'm sure this is pretty difficult to understand as far as we got. But I think we'll publish the paper.
Okay.
Publish the paper so that you like to read through it and consider it a little bit more, have a little bit more time to consider what the points that are being made. I think you might appreciate a little bit more what we're trying to say here.
There's still 10 minutes available for Q&A.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other point I was making with that slide of the pizza pie and the apple pie, there's a problem with the modern ideology of empiricism. That if I say, do you want a piece? You might say, well, a piece of what? You can't satisfy a proper explanation of things by simply talking about pieces, parts, without saying what is a part of or a piece of. If I said you want a piece, you have no idea whether I'm talking about a piece of pie or a piece of earth or a piece of rock or whatever. Yet scientists are content with talking about pieces or atoms or molecules or whatever without saying what they are part of. In other words, the whole has to be included with the part in order to understand the part properly. This was Aristotle's idea also. They call it final cause. Final cause, as you could say, is the whole. You can't give a causal explanation or a proper explanation of things without saying what it is that you're talking, it is a part of, or what it is that it exists for. This he stated very explicitly. It was necessary not only to say that something exists, but that for which it exists. Exists for the sake of what? He thought this was an important point in speaking about things as existing. So the result is that today we talk about, let's say, carbon atom. Now, according to the modern idea where final cause is eliminated from any consideration, the carbon atom in an elephant's leg and the carbon atom at the end of your nose, there's no difference. There's no way of differentiating them as such. So to know what something is part of is also important for understanding that part properly. Otherwise, we come to some kind of what we call an atomic monism. Carbon atoms are the same no matter where they are in the universe, no matter what they constitute. There's a kind of a monism, a reductionistic or abstract understanding of carbon. Anyhow, that's one of the pet peeves that I have and study and understanding the philosophy of science. All right, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for tolerating me.
Oh, it's our pleasure, Maharaj, to hear you. And so it was a very wonderful talk. You sketch a perspective that acknowledges the remarkable, unique aspect of life and to help redefine the key terms and identify deep essential features of concept for a meaningful future regarding life and cognition. Thank you, Maharaj, for your nice talk. And there's only, I think, 5 minutes left for the question. If we can take only one question, one or two, if anyone from the audience.
If no one is asking, then can I ask something? Or if someone else want to ask, then they can ask.
Please, Maharaj, you can ask.
This feeling for the self, which is the negative unity of the concept with its externality, means the reality, that is a system of organs, system of say circulation, nervous system, etc. So how can this modern people trained in modern scientific era, but beginning to realize that we need to account for subjectivity or like emotions or behavioral characteristics, mother-child identity, etc. How can they, graduate to this kind of thought, as was being given by you here?
Well, as I said, I was only giving a kind of a framework by which things can be understood. The details of how Hegel's philosophy of life can be utilized to explain molecular phenomena. That is a problem that he was not aware of, first of all, and that's very difficult to solve, although he did give some hints in his anthropology about how that might be understood. but I think it is a very difficult problem. And I have not become expert in that type of explanation myself without further effort and study in that area. So my idea here was merely to give a suggestion, an idea of a direction in which we might go, and perhaps encourage people to study Hegel and try to see how what he was saying and what we are trying to understand in biology today may be related.
Thank you, Maharaj. But it does talk about certain primitive notions, at least what was prevalent in his days. Like he talks about digestive systems, he talks about the sensory systems, he talks
Right.
about the nervous system, for example, also. And then he says they are the determinations of the concept of the organism into externality. And then he talks about something about the individual. Like it, for example, he talks about digestion as a kind of leading to the concept of reproduction, by which the organism is actually living. That means he says the organism is alive not as a because it is existing, but because it produces itself as a living entity. Like in reproduction, it is like alive. So that means this it seems teleologically, of whatever reasons, he identified this reproducibility with the concept of the organism. But it is not a reproducibility in the sense of modern understanding, because for him it requires some kind of a negation of the externality by which it is positing itself as an organism.
That is another more complex subject. Actually, my talk was on the logic of life more than the application of that concept of life in nature. When we add the explanation of life in nature, it becomes much more complex because we have to deal with externality. And merely the logical concept of life, we only deal with the internal dialectical relationships. But in the nature, it takes on a more complex form. And I have not discussed that part in this lecture. So that requires another study in and of itself. It's very complex indeed.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah, only 2 minutes left. Please ask in a brief.
Yeah, it's not a question. I would like to firstly thank Bhakti Madhava Puri ji for such an enlightening talk. What I would like to, I have been practicing meditation for the past 2 decades, and it's my personal opinion that how much ever knowledge you try to gain through the worldly process of studying, reading books or experiments, the more you gain knowledge, the more you feel that you know nothing. And I feel meditation is one process. It's an process to connect with your inner self, and that is the only process to comprehend life as a whole. I would like your comments on this.
Yes, of course. I agree entirely with that. As I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, we are neglecting to understand the scientist. In science, there is something else going on that's far more important and fundamental and essential to science, and that is the self. And we know that the ancient Greek philosophers, they also understood that above all else, know thyself, as they said. Once that is understood, then everything else can follow in a proper order. So there is great wisdom in that idea, and understanding. But modern science, unfortunately, doesn't understand that at all. So we're studying and gathering knowledge in so many things, and yet we have lost ourselves, knowledge of ourselves, and that all that study, so-called study. In fact, once I had the opportunity to meet Albert Szent-Györgyi as a Nobel laureate at MIT when I was living in that area, Boston area. And after a talk, I got to speak with him a bit, and I was trying to discuss with him the idea that of life coming from life rather than from matter. And he famously once said about that topic, he said, I have studied life for many decades, and studying the electrons and the molecules and so on and so forth. And in that study, it seems that life has kind of slipped through my fingers like sand, picking up sand, and the whole of life just slips through our fingers, because talking about life in terms of molecules are not alive. So you're missing the whole point of what is life. That's why I've emphasized this point, negativity. What is not matter, that is life. Not matter means that matter is not annihilated, but it's not life. There has to be some other negative idea associated with it that we're not including in our discussion and contemplation about the nature of life.
Thank you.
Dr. Chittaranjan Sarkar has some question, but I think he has got the answer of his question in this explanation of Dr. Madhava Puri Maharaj.
And Dr. Puri will be joining us at the end of the conference for the interdisciplinary dialogue as well, so there'll be more opportunity to speak at that time.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Puri Maharaj, for your nice answer and wonderful presentation in your talk. Now I have to move for our next speaker.